Hello, my name is Bob Eccles, and it's my pleasure to once again be moderating a great webinar for now the fifth annual Accounting for a Sustainable World Conference. This webinar is timed perfectly because we're going to talk about this very interesting survey that Sabine Hoefnagel will be getting into, but it's a survey of 884 sustainability experts taking stock of where sustainability is in the world today. So for the Accounting for a Sustainable World Conference, knowing where sustainability is at, I think is very important. Let me briefly introduce the panelists, friends of mine, and then I'll explain kind of how we're going to have our conversation, and we'll just sort of see how it rolls. We're going to start with Sabine Hoefnagel. She is the Global Head of Sustainability and Risk for ERM. Sabine, I've known you for a while. You've been very helpful to me on my research and a lot of your colleagues, and so I certainly appreciate that. Next, we'll have, in order of speaking, Andrea Webster is another friend of mine. I use that term, kind of carefully because whenever I post on LinkedIn, I get these snarky comments from Andrea. And so then, it'll probably come out in this webinar. And so Andrea and I have this kind of shtick where we go back and forth. And she'll be bringing both a finance and an NGO perspective. And then finally, from a corporate perspective, which is obviously very important for a conference like this in this particular topic, we have, and I'm delighted to say, Rebecca Marmot, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer for Unilever. And so to start, Sabine, let me turn it over to you. You did this wonderful survey with GlobeScan and Volans. So you've got some slides to share with us all and give us some context, and then we're going to go to Andrea for kind of an NGO perspective, Rebecca for a corporate perspective. We'll all kind of jump in, I think, on the investor side, and we'll just have a fun conversation. So Sabine, over to you.
Thanks, Bob. Sounds great, and welcome everybody. Really great to see you on this webinar. I know we're all keen to get to the conversation, so let me dive right into the headlines from the recent Sustainability at a Crossroads research that we carried out, as Bob said, together with GlobeScan and Volans. So the research took place in May, so it's relatively fresh, and I think it taps into the zeitgeist. It's part of an ongoing research program which ERM has done with GlobeScan for many years, and Volans joined us in this year in 2025. Now, given the kind of geopolitical landscape and other volatility that's affecting sustainability, we really wanted to assess and understand what this moment really means. And as you'll see, we've seen some really big shifts in responses compared to last year. As Bob said, in terms of numbers, we've had some really positive response, almost 850 sustainability experts from 72 different countries. If you look at the geographical representation, it's definitely the more people from Europe and North America, but still, relevant numbers from other regions in the world. And if we're looking at the different sectors, a really broad representation from, various different organizations. So what did we ask? What was the survey all about? On the next slide, you can see that we really wanted to learn what the global sustainability community collectively thinks of the current agenda. And we posed a very simple question, as you can see on this slide, like, how do you personally feel about the current state of the sustainability agenda? And overwhelmingly, the respondents said it is time for a change. And in fact, 56% of people are calling for a radical revision. But in total, 93% of respondents are saying that the agenda needs to evolve. Only 6% of people who participated said that the way that we're going is fine and it's delivering. So then the next question that we kind of looked at is, if you look at the next slide, is, how much a kind of backlash against sustainability is influencing this. And really interesting to see, and perhaps not surprising, the difference from last year compared to this year, when going from 57% to 70% in terms of people who are saying globally that there is a significant backlash. In terms of the scores from different organizations on that question, not huge divergence, but really quite a lot of divergence if you look at the geography. So in North America, 91% of people feel that the backlash is significant, but in Asia, only, 38%, if I can read it correctly. So interesting kind of regional differences there. Then next, we asked the respondents to really kind of give their views on organizational performance. And you can see that on the next slide. And this is a question that we have actually researched for over a decade. And I will show some of these trends over time in a minute. But just kind of looking at like who comes out in top in terms of being rated excellent in terms of their performance and perhaps poor in terms of their performance. And, as you can see, academic institutions and NGOs receiving relatively positive responses, but also United Nations quite high up there, which I personally found surprising because national governments are way at the bottom. And, to some extent, the UN is really just a sum of the parts of all the national governments. But at the bottom, you're seeing private sector, institutional investors and national governments. Now, on the next slide, as I said, let's take a closer look at like how has that kind of evolved over the past 12 years. And you can see that there is really this kind of collective dissatisfaction with performance because all these different organizations went down compared to last year, apart from research and academic organizations, which is the only one who went up. But you're seeing some really, really kind of steep declines compared to last year for both NGOs and for citizen-led mass social movements, as well as the UN. And whilst the decline for the private sector is not maybe as steep, it is still the lowest score in the last 12 years. And I'm sure we'll debate that in some more detail in a minute. Now, the question really is, how do we revise our approach to increase the impact? Don't worry, this is an eye chart. We'll break this down in a minute. But basically what we did was we developed 64 levers of change that we could test on 2 dimensions. One is the feasibility of implementation, and the other one, how much potential impact would these actions have? And we then grouped those actions by different groups of actors. So we have blue, light blue for government and public policy. We have yellow or amber for investors and capital market. We have dark blue for corporate actions, and then pinkish for civil society. So let's take a closer look at that with the 4 different quadrants, starting first with the high impact and high feasibility quadrant. So quite a lot of actions, so that's promising, and kind of a good mix here. What is I think interesting is that most of the actions that are here are for corporates, even though their performance was rated close to the bottom. So I would see that they're still very much seen as the most important part of the solution, along with investors and NGOs. There's only 2 actions here that are related to government, and that chimes perhaps more closely with their bottom ranking in terms of their performance. The expectations there are very low. Now, in the top right-hand corner, you can see technology innovation and R&D for sustainability solutions being seen as the kind of highest impact and highest feasibility. But in addition, for corporates, we're seeing a range of actions that are connected to commercial and financial performance. So, for example, commercialization of sustainability through products and services, but also integration of sustainability into the business, integration of sustainability into investment planning. And I'm sure we'll discuss that more. We're also seeing supply chain here, sustainable finance and impact investing. For me, like examples that spring to mind from the real world are, for example, Walmart's Gigaton Challenge, where they engage with, 5,900 suppliers to drive down carbon emissions in their scope 3 emissions. And in fact, they reached 6 years before the deadline, a removal of 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions, either through avoidance, reductions, or sequestration. Similarly, like Colgate, have saved about $1 billion worth of, kind of operational costs through energy efficiency, and also Amazon that has achieved its 100% renewable energy goal 7 years ahead of the deadline, and that obviously provides them with, energy security at a stable price. For NGOs, what we're seeing here are constructive actions around building consumer awareness as well as capacity building, but there are also some in there that are related to more advocacy-oriented approaches, including political activism and media scrutiny. If we look at the second quadrant on the next slide, which is high impact, low feasibility. Now, this is, I think, interesting to see lots of government actions here, and that perhaps reflects the sentiment that government potentially could do a lot more that would have a high impact, but is very unlikely to happen. And we're talking here about drivers like subsidies and taxes that incentivize sustainable choices and solutions, also international trade policy favorable to sustainability. And, for me, the kind of low feasibility here is obviously linked to the current geopolitics and reluctance for any kind of progressive policy making in most places in the world. But also quite a few corporate actions here. And I think low feasibility here could potentially actually be linked to some of these actions needing government support to become possible. For example, actions like mandatory due diligence that can't happen without government acting. And possibly also around carbon pricing. But there are also some on here where corporates can really act if they really want to shift. For example, the actions around sustainability-linked compensation, as well as building the culture where employees prioritize sustainability in their day-to-day work. And, I come from ERM, which is a company that has done that successfully for the last 53 years. But I also think if we're looking at sustainability-linked compensation, I saw a recent survey from Willis Towers Watson that cited that 81% of business now have at least one metric linked to sustainability in incentive plans, and that's up 15% compared to 3 years ago. Now, if we're looking at the next quadrant on the next slide, we're going to low impact, high feasibility. And here for corporates, we're seeing the more kind of softer types of engagement like ratings and rankings and voluntary disclosure. I thought it was interesting to see that there's also business collaboration on this slide and industry standards. We so often hear how crucial that is to get anything done, but here it's being seen as having low impact. Perhaps the most interesting dot on this slide and in this quadrant is the AI one right at the top there. And I think that this is probably currently in this quadrant because we haven't really quite figured out yet how to really reap the benefits in terms of impact. And I really would expect that to change in coming years. If we only think about the example of Octopus Energy, for example, that basically went from being a startup to being a $10 billion valued company in 10 years, really using their AI platform, Kraken, to model what the most energy efficient renewable energy system could look like. They are now serving more than 70 million customers globally, and have also become the largest household supplier of renewable energy in the UK. And the way that they've done that really is to kind of linking energy transition into ordinary customers' lives through their AI platforms. And also through stakeholder engagement, which in fact is another action listed here as low impact. So I personally would expect these to shift. For NGOs, we're seeing actions here related to both positive and negative campaigning against or for business here, which perhaps aligns with the decline in perceived performance of NGOs that I mentioned earlier. Now, before we go to the discussion, the last quadrant, which is low impact, low feasibility, and it's a bit of a mixed bag here for all different types of actors. There's a number of kind of legacy type aspects of sustainability that mostly relate to the UN system, like the Paris Agreement, the UN Global Compact Principles for Responsible Business, SDGs, and other types of frameworks that, have been seen as potentially very useful in shaping principles, but confidence in their role going forward up to 2030 is pretty low. I thought this was slightly strange because the UN was still scoring pretty high in terms of performance, as we saw earlier. In fact, they were sort of seen as the third highest. And then also interestingly, from a corporate perspective, we're seeing geoengineering and CCUS scored as very low. And I thought that was interesting because actually technology innovation and R&D was being seen as the highest impact and the highest feasibility of all actions in a previous slide. And with CCUS, for example, you could argue that although it will be very, very CapEx heavy over time, it is very possible that it will still pay off. Anyway, where do we go from here? Well, to our discussion in the very near term. For us at ERM, this broader research is really meant to help us understand better what the challenges and opportunities are that lie ahead for all these different groups of actors, and really to be a catalyst for discussion and for review of what is working and what isn't working, and where should we go next. So, Bob, with that, I'll kick it back over to you to get us into the discussion.
So I'd like to get you, Sabine, to reflect on something, and I'm going to have Andrea do the same thing and ask her a few questions. What is striking to me about this is all of these conventions, frameworks, and so forth that you pointed out. When you think about the amount of attention and kind of airtime and bandwidth and press that's been written, I mean, it's just like they flooded the zone with these things, and they come through as low impact and low visibility. Why do you think that's the case?
Why do I think it's the case that they're seeing as low impact or low feasibility, or why are they getting so much airtime?
Well, they're getting so much airtime. It's like both, right? They're getting all this airtime, but they're not making much difference according to the survey of sustainability experts. It's so, would we be better off without these things? Are they just being executed poorly? Do people not understand them? Is it the wrong strategy? I mean, this is really telling.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I think there's probably a difference here between some of the kind of the UN frameworks that are really geared at government action, and then those that are more actually focused on creating standards and principles for business. I think personally, I think that the Paris Agreement and the same with the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, etc. These are really frameworks that are designed for governments, and the kind of high interest and engagement from business over the last few years, although initially very much welcomed, if we're thinking back to Glasgow, for example, if we're thinking about the COPs, I think that is starting to wane a little bit in terms of effectiveness, and it will be really interesting to see what will happen at this upcoming COP in Belém this year. The expectation is that there will probably be less business, present there, and that it will be more back to the governments to really try and focus on what they need to do. As I said earlier, what for me is really surprising is this kind of relatively high trust in the UN, and then very kind of low expectations with what it will deliver. So there's a dichotomy here. Then other reasons why is this getting so much attention? I think that, for the media, these are like really big moments, to kind of capitalize on, so that, kind of gets a lot of traction. But in the end, almost all of what's on this page will need national governments to act for any of it to really have any impact in the real world. And there are examples where that has worked. If we're thinking about the Montreal Protocol with regards to CFCs many years ago, that's actually been incredibly effective. And, we really have seen that problem to a large extent being gone away through, initially a UN approach, and then kind of through translation into national governments, into regulation. So I don't know, just a few observations there.
Which is one comment, and I didn't want to interrupt you earlier. So you talk about the UN. Sabine, it's 28%. It's only 28%. I mean, Trump's got approval ratings that are higher than 28%. So for me, 28% is like a low number. It's bigger than the 12% of the 14% for the private sector and institutional investors, and 2% for governments. But maybe we can dig into that more. So Andrea, you're an ambassador to the World Benchmarking Alliance. You're working with the PRI, which is on this list here in this slide, doing kind of finance-oriented pre-COP work. You've got an investment background. You come out of the NGO world. NGOs were even higher in their dissatisfaction with the current strategy. I think they were at 70-something%, Sabine, if I remember correctly. So I'm kind of scratching my head here a little bit. And it's down, that slide you showed, Sabine, they've gone from 60% to 45%. It looks to me like the NGOs and governments have really, looking at this slide here, they've really been in control of the sustainability agenda. People are unhappy with them. NGOs are unhappy with governments. I don't know how they feel about themselves. So, Andrea, what's going on here?
Okay. I am I think it's easy to find scapegoats in this discussion, and NGOs are the easy whipping boy in this. But I'm just going to come back. First of all, I just want to put perspective on the sample size on this. The fact that NGOs represent only 9% of the 850 respondents, and nearly 40% of them are corporates. So there's a skew there. But stepping aside from that, yes, there is a lot of discussion and reflection that's happening in the nonprofit space, but I think that's happening across the whole of sustainability, and that's what's marked that is the current agenda are good enough. That dissatisfaction is coming through the fact that we are a pivotal I can't speak that evolutionary moment on where it's at. But coming back here on these principles, I think one of the points where we are in the evolution is that we wouldn't be at the point where academia is regarded as a higher priority if the NGOs hadn't been there in the first place. So I think their role in this is evolving. When we look at all these frameworks, and see, again, you look at the sample size, government is only 4%. And where the boundaries are being pushed, and we're now moving into the territory is what is hard. And I think that's where the dissatisfaction is coming up from these frameworks. Now, when I move around companies, I want to move around financial institutions. Those that are working in sustainability, Rebecca, I'm interested in your thought on this, welcome the fact that there are these frameworks, there are grounding principles. The UNGPs, for example, when you have uncertainty in the political environment with changing government agendas, the fact that corporates and finance have got a unifying principle that they can anchor to and explain what they're doing is incredibly helpful in this polarizing environment. And I think what comes out in this survey, and you say I'm snarky to you, Bob, but you throw a grenade and I have to react to it.
Fair enough.
When this survey came out, I emailed you a whole long list of this is why. There's generalizations in this. Now, when I'm at COP, and Rebecca, again, interested in your thoughts on this, and the recent Finance for Development talks in Seville, every 10 years, all governments come together to talk about development finance. Now, private finance says that's nothing to do with me, but you can really clearly see private finance is in the room. The big US institutions are there, Bob. Now, 10 years ago, they wouldn't have been. Now they are. And they can sniff an opportunity. It's coming. It's just below the radar. And I'd be really interested, Sabine, of what the job functions were of the people responding to this survey. Now, if I speak to somebody who's in a reporting function, they're exhausted. So perhaps this is reflected in here. If I speak to somebody in investment team who are doing deals, this is a shifting structural change, and they are in the room. They know this is happening, and they know that the short-term politics, despite what's happening with the culture wars, Bob, they know there's an opportunity here. It's happening. So I think it very much depends on who you're talking to, what the function is, and whereabouts in the world. Now, that regional narrative is really important. I think Asia Pacific is positioning sustainability as a competitive advantage and an opportunity for economic growth, kind of future-proofing and building our economies. Whereas what you've had in Europe, it's been about climate. And a lot of what the NGO space is learning is the need to pivot the narrative so you include more people and you're responding to what that macro political backdrop is. Lots more to say, but I've got to stop there. I've got my flow going now. I'm on it.
Andrea, no, I completely agree with you. Like the point that you made early on that, I think a lot of what's on this page is also, this is where a lot of the groundwork was laid, to some extent many years ago. And a lot of the other actions in the other quadrants wouldn't have been possible if none of this would have happened. So let's also not forget that these actions are really, the question really was about, how important are they going to be in terms of feasibility and impact by, in the next 5 years? And perhaps that is another reason why we're seeing all these frameworks showing up in this quadrant.
Yeah, and I think one really interesting observation that struck me on this, so that we're in a point where we need innovation now. The system has pushed as far as it can under the existing rules of the game, and we now need to be changing. That there are some really fundamental changes that need to happen, and that needs innovation. Now, the number one high impact, high feasibility was a need for innovation. And for me, that corresponds with the fact that it's identified that academia are playing a greater role. Now, academia typically for research, they lead in those areas. And again, the generalizations on the different stakeholders, corporates fund a lot of academia, and it's a safe place for them to be involved in, perhaps less so in the US, but anyway. But also academia leans a lot into the NGOs. There's a lot of information and data flow. I've experienced this myself, where NGOs help bolster the resources of academia. So there's some blurred lines here, but you can see the fit to what's going to come next, to what's going to be high impact, high feasibility.
So just an editorial comment on academic institutions. I want to turn it over to Rebecca and maybe pull up that slide again of high impact, high feasibility. I think you're right. I mean, no disrespect to academics. I'm an academic. It's largely academics that are going to be listening to this first time around, but they don't really do things. They think stuff and they write stuff. NGOs do things, so having that bloodline is really important. I mean, I'm glad there's smart people doing stuff, but without NGOs and these other actors, nothing would really happen. Rebecca, over to you. You can pick this up wherever you want, this particular slide, some of the questions that Andrea talked to you, because you have lived through this kind of in an organization people have been very focused on for many years through different CEOs. And so you've been kind of riding these waves as a corporate leader in sustainability, and lately been getting pushed back from the left and the right. And so you're in a great place to kind of talk to us about kind of how you see what the results of this survey mean for the corporate community, starting with Unilever.
So firstly, thanks GlobeScan and ERM and Bollins. I thought it was a fascinating piece of work. And I think it's quite pivotal for all of us, actually, because, on the one hand, there's quite a lot of negative sentiment, and we'll, come to that and we'll talk about it. But actually, on the other hand, I think it does show that the understanding around the importance of this transformation is now mainstream. And this is, right, let's get down to the details and the nitty-gritty about what we need to do. Clearly, there is something that isn't resonating, and there are multiple kind of structural issues that the report goes into. There's definitely something around the business case that isn't being articulated in the right way. I agree, and there was lots and lots to delve into here about the roles of the different stakeholders that are involved. I did think there is something even more pivotal, and I know a couple of things to talk about. You talked about the COP that's coming up, but even recently that the plastics treaty, which I was just going to use as an example. I think business has tried really, really hard, and clearly we've not cracked this yet, to look at the role that we can play to advocate for progressive policies with governments. Because I think if we do that, governments need to know that the private sector wants change, but we need that de-risking. If they de-risk, then that helps us in terms of raising capital. So if you think about, for example, the recent plastics treaty, there was, a lot of enthusiasm around the hope of the plastics treaty a year ago. Unfortunately, it hasn't come out with the outcome that at the moment we all wanted, but the business coalition, which is over 300 different private sector companies from a variety of different sectors, not just FMCG, got together because they wanted to give governments the confidence to push for this high ambition treaty. So basically to say, if you put together a globally harmonized framework rather than leaving it down to sort of voluntary obligations, which quite frankly aren't really going to happen, there's a super clear business case there. From a impact perspective, they did some calculations and said there'd be twice as many problematic and avoidable plastic products removed if you came up with this much more progressive and harmonized regulatory approach. It would also help boost investments in things like better recycling infrastructure. And I can see EPR has come up in a couple of those charts. And of course, governments like that because it helps to create jobs. And so there is there's a boost to the economy. But actually, it didn't work. There were too many different interest groups. And so we're going back. People haven't given up on that. But I think this ability for governments, for the private sector to be crystal clear. Unilever launched a second climate transition action plan last year. So we went into really quite deep granular detail on the 10 different levers that we as a business would need to activate if we're going to get to our emissions reductions target by 2030, as well as thinking longer term about net zero. And so we're very clear what's the positive regulatory environment that will help us to get there and to do that. So you need governments to play their role from that perspective, the NGOs to then to come in to help civil society raising awareness. You need investors to come in and understand and realise, there is a financial opportunity here as well. And I think the system just seems to be slightly out of kilter right now. So you've got a lot of self-interest from different stakeholder groups. I do think it shows that the current system isn't working, and there's definitely been a marked shift from a corporate perspective on sustainability. We, as Unilever, but lots of other companies going through this process as well at the moment, really revamped and approached our sustainability strategy quite differently last year. So we went from having a whole spectrum of over 40 different commitments spanning a whole raft of different areas to saying, what do we really need to focus on where we can have a material impact, which for us is climate, nature, plastics and livelihood. So still 4 massive big areas, but they're the areas where we can make a difference. Then we said, as well as having the sort of long-term targets, which are great for galvanizing action and, setting a North Star, we need to actually short-term what we're doing, because if we don't really think about what needs to be done in the next 6 months and in the next 12 months, actually you're not going to get to the 2030 or the 2039 targets. So I think that urgency is something that is really changing as well. And I think that shift away from these big, great sort of, PR grabbing headlines into, right, this is what we need to do this year. This is what it looks like. This is what it means if I work in R&D. These are the new formulations I need to work on. This is what it means if I work in supply chain. I know that actually it's these 25 suppliers that I need to think about in terms of reducing my carbon footprint in regenerative agriculture. It's these 25 suppliers I need to work on when I think about biotech alternatives to fossil fuels, for example, in our laundry portfolio. So I'd say that granularity, that short-term focus, and this work on systems change needs to be done. I think the report highlights there are, at the moment, still quite fragmented approaches to what does that mean in reality.
Can I respond to that? Because I think I think you've explained that really well, but there's a few points behind that. I think the word that's coming to my mind is a recalibration. Is that the current system, it's not fit for purpose. It needs recalibrating to catch up with where we all are and where the next big hurdle is. And it's interesting because you just touched on shorter term and then you talk about system change. Now, different actors, different stakeholders working on this, and definitely within the non-profit space in the NGO world, you've got those that are driving long-term system change, and they are asking those big questions because they need to be asked. But then as you come down to more of the granular level, what are the nuts and the bolts and what people are doing in their day-to-day job in business that they can push forward on, and where NGOs can champion? And Rebecca, I'm sure the role that NGOs have had, be them activist advocacy or accountability, have all in some way shaped where Unilever has gone, what their journey is going to be. And each has a lane that they're in and a function that they provide. But I think at some instances, there's a greater need of one than the other. And I think that's the recalibration that's probably happening in the non-profit space, but it's still valuable. And I look at the piece that you mentioned on behavioural change and about educating the consumer. And that was, again, in the high impact, high feasibility. Now, NGOs are going to have a huge role to play because they're more trusted than governments and corporates.
Let me ask you.
Yeah, sorry, Bob, go on.
No, go ahead.
Yes,
go ahead.
I agree, Andrea. I totally get all of the stakeholders have a role to play. Definitely. I think that for me, it just seems that some of the stakeholders have fallen slightly out of kilter. If we go back to sort of talking about plastics, we were clear as the business coalition, that's 300 private sector companies, have said lots and lots of different sectors, around pushing for a globally harmonised framework. We wanted there to be legally binding frameworks around the use of plastic so that we could be very certain, because actually if you've got that de-risks investment from the private sector, because that's what the private sector want. They want certainty. The NGOs are hugely important in then also helping to galvanise action, among consumers. And, I think that's the same when you look at a whole variety of different topics. I think there is a shift from, we talked a bit, and Sabine, you talked about this a lot in the report, from the sort of big multilateral kind of high level, these big profile campaigns, into much more structured approaches. So, we used to spend a lot of time, and we will still be very involved with the UN and the SDGs and Paris, etc., moving forward. But I definitely see a shift into more national level policy. And again, it's sort of quite an interesting dichotomy, because you talked at the beginning around people do trust these big global frameworks and they trust the UN. And that's right, they do, because they set this sort of global vision. But actually at country level now, if I think about the run up to Belém, we've been pushing for really strong NDCs and nationally defined contributions in the countries where Unilever has a big presence. So actually it's much better for us to think about, let's focus in on these 15 countries. We know actually that's where we have a sizable emissions number on the ground that we need to think about. I mentioned the work that we've been doing with R&D and home care. We're looking at how do we change out the fossil fuel based surfactants into looking at biotech. So there's a massive opportunity there from an R&D perspective. It's exciting, it's new innovation, it's new opportunities. We know that actually if we concentrate on doing that in India, that can really help us in terms of our own climate transition journey. It's something the Indian government's really interested in. They're really building up at the moment their biotech industry, and again, of course, then there's a role for NGOs as well. So I think maybe we're moving from this, what I meant, and perhaps didn't articulate it well, this really, period of excitement, and we had these long-term goals and everyone was sort of very motivated about changing the world, into much more tangible, this is what I can do in my domain, these are the areas I can have an impact on. For us, it's climate, nature, plastics, livelihoods. These are the stakeholders that I need to work with. I'm going to build it into my financial planning cycle in these countries. These are the partners that I'll work with in supply chain. These are the investors I'll work with. And I just think that that level of tangibility is absolutely critical if you want to make the shift into actually seeing change, rather than this excitement around having change, but it not necessarily coming to fruition.
Yeah, and I think what I'm sort of hearing in like listening to both of you, like another way of framing this entire report would be not necessarily to say, okay, what we have is not working. It's maybe to say what we need going forward is just different, given the fact of where we're at. And so much has also been achieved. Like, let's not forget that almost none of these topics would ever be in the boardroom, like, for many companies, even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's a massive change. And I think where we are now, like what you were talking about, Rebecca, with Unilever, kind of going from, this really wide range of metrics and goals, to actually really focusing on what's like truly material and truly sort of existential maybe to your business, is a very logical evolution of where we need to go. Similarly, with like really making this very strong link between sustainability and enterprise value, right? Like no company is ever going to do this, for morality reasons. Like this really has to have, like, I feel we're now in a sort of era where sustainability also needs to stand on its own two commercial and financial feet. And we need to be able to get, much better at being able to quantify that. And, we've been doing some interesting work around that, and, they're baby steps, and maybe the numbers aren't huge, but you can prove this in financial value. And I think that is, just all of that is sort of part of this kind of evolution that we're going at. And, so there is another way that we can spin this report. This is not all like, oh, what a crisis, we're not going anywhere. It's maybe there is a huge opportunity, and we need to shift to get to the next level of implementation that is needed.
Let me ask all three of you two questions that comes directly out of this conversation. And we'll start with what you were just saying, Sabine. So this connection to enterprise value, absolutely agree. I'm doing some work with a colleague of mine, Shivaram Rajgopal, at Columbia. So we'd love to have a chat with you about it. But I vividly recall, Rebecca, when, Heinz Schumacher was the CEO and you came out with the 4 things you're focused on. Sir Jonathan Porritt had a hissy fit and, kind of did the big takedown. He'd been an advisor to you. And then I wrote my response and went back and forth. The question is, so the people that see companies' mission in the world to change the world and make it a better place, that ignore the need to create shareholder value, how much of a drag is that on just the overall agenda? I think the direction of travel for what companies have to do is clear, But when I look at the boycotts and the campaigns, I mean, I see that stuff as largely unhelpful. And, Andrea may disagree. So the first question I have for all of you is, can we get enough consensus among all of these stakeholder groups that, yes, companies shouldn't make the world a worse place, but they have to deliver returns for shareholders and take the material issues, not all the issues, into account? How do the three of you think about that in terms of kind of the public mood today?
I think it's really dangerous, Bob, to be binary about it. And I think it's, if you forgive me, I think that was sort of a conversation 10 years ago for Unilever and for many other businesses. Sustainability is part of your long-term financial planning and business success. It has to be something which helps to drive shareholder value. So it's a key element that underpins our performance, whether we're talking about resilience in the supply chain, whether it's around meeting consumer expectations around great products, helping us. I talked about operating in a stable business environment. All of that is really important, and it comes from driving impact for the business. So that is absolutely essential. I talked about us prioritizing on climate, nature, plastics and livelihoods, and we do that because we know that they are of material importance to the business. So that's a maturing of a sustainability agenda, which is, I think, happening in many different companies and organizations. And it makes sense to focus on those big ticket items that you can have a positive impact on. And I think the report sort of starts to pull that out. The value creation part comes when you then take that down to the next stage. So, thinking about technology and innovation and R&D, and Sabine, you talked quite a lot about that in the report. It is in businesses' interest to accelerate circular models and invest in sustainable innovation. So it's not about just compliance and BS, and one of you mentioned around the reporting burden, which is a lot in a company that is headquartered out of Europe. But again, that helps to standardize, and you're comparing apples and apples. So that that's a good thing. But actually, it's also about unlocking new markets, and it's about improving efficiencies, and it's about future-proofing operations. So when we've moved to biodegradable formulations and scaling low carbon logistics, that's saving us money. We've invested about 150 million euros over recent years in how we're going to decarbonize, and have decarbonized our manufacturing sites to really sort of bring that to life as one example. So consumers demand better products. They want to see better products. They're expecting better products, and that's everything. That's the consumer sensorials, that's around the packaging, that's around the branding, that's around the marketing. So if you think around something, we just launched a brand in Europe called Wonder Wash. So it addresses the consumer's concern that many consumers have today around wanting to do a quick, short wash. Consumers want to do 15-minute washes now. Many people don't have really dirty clothes, so they don't need to run a washing machine with all the cost that is attached to that. And of course, from an environmental perspective, heating, the water, etc. So it makes a much simpler and easier and more sustainable proposition, and ultimately it's better for the consumer. We're thinking around using a lot more probiotics, for example, with Cif Infinite Clean. So it's using microorganisms to clean work surfaces in the kitchen, and lots and lots of different examples where we're using less plastics or recycled plastics, which is saving money. So I think it's really binary to say it's one or the other. It's definitely not. And I think the point that came up as well in the report around AI and the importance of AI and the importance of tech, all of those things are enabling us to scale more quickly, smarter solutions, much more impactful. So I think I just will caution against saying it's sort of on this side it's a sustainable option which isn't really going to create value, and on this side there's some other that I think that's far too binary and is as dangerous. Actually, it's a dangerous conversation to get into.
I just wanted to respond to that. Bob, you and I have had some really big discussions on enterprise value and fiduciary duty. And the public mood, you say, are we reading the public mood? What is the public mood? And I think when I'm going to come at this through a finance lens and through the asset owners that I speak to and the big institutions, obviously, finance and the dealing, it's dog eat dog and people are looking for a great return. But I can tell you actually wider and beyond that, those at the top of the food chain in finance, they are looking at sustainability. So you look at some of the big pension funds, their members are voting for them to invest sustainably. So that is increasingly in their mandate. I think also the reputational risk is huge, especially across supply chains. And that takes you beyond climate, that takes you into social issues. I think a lot of the nuance comes of the type of issue that you're dealing with, but I don't think you can make a sweeping generalization about what the public mood is. The direction that it's going, there is a fundamental shift in values of the generations that are coming behind us. There might be pushback in some jurisdictions, but the underlying direction is there. So sustainability isn't going away. So the need for enterprise value, yes, of course, it has to make business sense, but I think there's a time horizon on this, and those that are thinking longer term, depending on the nature of their business, need to look beyond just enterprise value. What's the direction of travel? And it's interesting, Rebecca, when I listen to you talk about what Unilever are doing, like, how did that get on the agenda in the first place? How did it get onto the C-suite? How did that become so entrenched? Was it regulation? Was it an underlying structural shift in the public mood? Interesting.
I mean, I think good businesses have always and will always try and manage their risk and look for opportunities. And so many of these risks and opportunities are linked to sustainability topics. And so therefore, like, I agree with Rebecca, like to make this into this very binary debate is not helpful. And I think, again, if you're looking at what companies are doing, even with some of the political shifts that we're seeing, there's loads of surveys out there. There's one from BDO, there's one from Kearney's, like, all saying that in for 2025 onwards, companies are expecting to increase their investments related to sustainability actions. So maybe they will talk about it differently, maybe they will frame it differently, but the actual actions that are happening are increasing, not decreasing. Now, there will always be some companies who will, perhaps, try and ride a different wave, but those were already the companies who were never, the leading companies from a sustainability perspective, previous of some of these political shifts. Similarly, like, we haven't really talked much about investors, but if you're looking, like, and again in the quadrant with high impact, high feasibility, sustainability and green bonds, etc., was in there, and the World Bank basically said that, like, in annual issuance in 2024 was like above 1 trillion, and they expect it to go up again in 2025. These are really meaningful numbers. So again, like, I don't think the binary debate is helpful.
So look, I agree on the binary debate, and it's like, and most people aren't taking that position. I think the extremes on the left and the right are, but the elephant in the room, one of the elephants in the room, is the United States. I'm the token American on this thing. So, like, I live here, right? 91% of North America said there was a pushback on sustainability. We've got the biggest capital markets in the world. 8 of the largest 10 asset managers are U.S. And so, they're all being pressured from kind of both sides, right? From the kind of NGOs who say make the world a better place, and then the far right that says if you utter the word ESG, then you're pursuing a progressive, woke political agenda. So, Sabine, you work with, and you mentioned these other surveys, I mean, you work with companies all over the world. Do you think that, language aside, there's really no difference in terms of how American companies are approaching sustainability than European ones? And as you said, in Asia, it's seen more as a source of competitive advantage, or do you see some pullback here because of the politicization that's happened in the United States on American companies?
I think it's still really difficult to answer that question, and I think it is too early to say so. What we are seeing is lots of companies are waiting with regards to investment decisions, etc., in North America, but not so much because of the kind of political mood, but because of the tariff implications. So that is really slowing companies down. Now, okay, apart from a few topics. So if we're thinking about offshore wind, okay, that is not going to happen for some time. The same with renewables on federal lands. That's not going to go anywhere. So I think it will take some time to shake out. I personally think that the US economy is going to lose out compared to some other economies in the world who are not seeing these kind of the same political headwinds, and they will come out of it both from a sustainability perspective and from a commercial and financial perspective better than the US. But exactly how this will, what the shifts will be, I think it's still early to say. We're not seeing currently many companies really changing course.
I mean, look, I agree with you in terms of the United States. It is astonishing to me. I mean, Ronald Reagan must be turning over in his grave at what the GOP has become, where you have Trump acting like a socialist, putting his thumb on the scales of which industries he wants to support and which not. But I tend to be an optimist, so I think, this will eventually pass. Let me go back to plastics. Because, Rebecca, as you know, I followed that reasonably closely. I'm not an expert in plastics, so I wrote about it a little bit, worked with you guys. I was incredibly enthusiastic about that. And I think we're letting the governments off the hook a little bit too soon. You had 300 companies that were supporting this. You had NGOs that are involved. It's a global thing, so it's not national. I think your point's, Rebecca, about national. But it's a very targeted thing. And across the political spectrum, people care about plastics. I mean, plastics are always coming up. So what happened? What would it take? Right? Carbon pricing would be another example. That was in the top quadrant. What do we need to do in terms of, because the business community is there, your points about leveling the playing field is absolutely important. Voluntary action is going to do it. You and I, Rebecca, have talked about that with income inequality. It's a similar thing. So what can we learn from this global plastics treaty to say, okay, here's what it takes in terms of the business community, the NGOs, the investors, to have the support and the political will so you can get governments over the line to create this level playing field. Because if we could kind of crack the nut on plastics, I think it gives us a good model for going forward. So I just love the views of all of you on the plastics treaty and lessons we can learn.
I'm an optimist as well, Bob. I would like to think that there will be, I think, and I don't think it's totally decided yet, but I think there'll be sort of one more kind of final stab at this. So there may be a scenario where we end up with a coalition of the willing. So the sort of the high ambition, medium ambition countries do come together, and at least there is a partly harmonized framework, not in every country, but in a number of countries. And I hope that the governments in those countries, and there are many of them, then have the confidence to push for that treaty. And as I said, there's a really strong business case for doing that. Nobody wants plastic waste, but actually there are positives as well, in addition to eliminating plastic waste or massively reducing plastic waste, but more investment into recycling infrastructure, EPR programs, well-designed EPR programs, good job creation opportunities. So I think, it's probably, we go back to that thing we were talking a little bit about at the beginning, is the big multilateral treaties and sort of the heydays of the 2015. Is it time for that right now? Maybe not. Maybe this is more around thinking of what we need to do at national level, where there is a clear win-win situation for governments, for industry, all the stakeholders we're talking about, investors, NGOs, but communities, etc., and helping to identify those sweet spots, because I think there's clearly enough enthusiasm and energy from certain stakeholders to do that on plastics. Maybe it's not the time for a utopian vision for everybody, but I think this like-minded and shared interest is, I hope, something that will be prevalent in a number of different areas. You've seen it in some examples in the energy sector. We're starting to see that as well. I think there's a greater understanding at the moment around the role of nature and nature in combating climate solutions. Regenerative agriculture is something that seems to be gaining traction in lots of countries around the world. It's a way to help farmers to boost their yields, to earn more money, to protect the soil and help future generations of farmers, while helping to provide really high quality, good, nutritious food at affordable prices. And that's absolutely critical, because cost of living, if you're a government, is something which is absolutely paramount in many different countries around the world. So I think it's less around the virtue signaling and the PR, and it's more around really clear advocacy that changes the rules and the incentives and makes it in more people's interest, more stakeholders' interest, to find these kind of solutions.
And I think, so the plastics treaty, I think we all sighed at that. It was so close. I didn't dig into it. I admit I've just read kind of the headline stuff, and it looks to me like that it was the oil nations that held it back. And so I'm a sweeping generalisation, I'm not sure I'm supposed to say that, but entrenched interests. And so there's a timeline on it. One of the things that I would say from being in finance and then moving into the non-profit and watching the policy space is that corporates can move in ways that governments can't. And I say this a lot. So Unilever, you have more freedom than a lot of politicians. And I think we're moving into a period now where regulation is so important, because that's what creates a level playing field and when business pays attention. But where that's shift now, we really do need courageous, strong leaders in the private sector to come in where governments at the moment are, where it's fragmenting. And my concern, I get you on a national level, a lot of these, the nuance of the solutions come at a national level. But the other thing I see though is that everyone's looking after their own national interests, you lose the harmonisation piece. And that happens with carbon markets, where people are protecting their own. So I can see a place, I think it's really important that big corporates, and Unilever does this, that you keep supporting the multilateral system, you still keep supporting the UN. It is flawed, but there is nothing better at the moment, and it is the one place where everybody's together. Rebecca, I know you've been to COP. It is a mind-blowing moment, but when you have every country in the world other than the US and Argentina represented there, it is so powerful at the discussions that happen around it, and the deals and on what's happening around the side of it. So my ask would be that perhaps operationally you're at a national level, but you still do support that multilateral piece. We need some bold leadership.
We're kind of coming to the end here. Let's do this. If you could each have one thing you'd like to see happen over the next 5 years, that it's a hard thing to happen, so it's not high feasibility, but it's a possible thing to happen, so it's not a low feasibility. Pick one thing that you'd like to see happen over the next 5 years that you think would move the needle to a significant extent on establishing kind of a new approach, a new strategy for sustainability, which is what the survey shows is needed in our conversation. What would that one thing be? And we can start with whoever wants to go first.
I think it's probably already I think it was actually in the high feasibility, high impact. And that is about strengthening the links between sustainability and enterprise value, and really looking at the kind of financial quantification. Not just that, because the sustainability impact is just as important, but I do think there needs to be more of a balance between these two things. That, and I'm going to squeeze in a second, which is like an unlock of the carbon markets.
I'm with you on the carbon markets. Andrea, you want to go?
Well, I've got three I can't pick. Carbon markets, I think, are absolutely crucial. It's such a polarizing subject, but I think carbon markets, do you know what, Bob? I'm going to put ISSB in there, the adoption of ISSB, having seen how IFRS is used. And I know that's controversial, but I just think that's the building blocks for so much. And this is a small one, but I think it's a biggie. We need more people from business and finance working in the non-profit space, and more people in non-profit going to work in business. We've got to fix that narrative. People keep talking about it not working, and I don't see it changing. We've got to get more movement across the sectors.
Rebecca?
Try and keep mine granular based on what we've been doing at Unilever. But I think you've got to, if you're in the corporate sector, treat sustainability with the same rigor and professionalism as your financial planning. So actually embed sustainability into your growth plans with costed, time-bound roadmaps and executive incentives. And I think if the really big private sector organizations, and many are doing that, really are that tangible, you will start to see progress. And I think, like I said at the beginning, if that happens, then you're helping governments to put in place the right policies because you're de-risking their investment. Then you're helping investors to say, okay, I see a company that is thinking ahead, they're de-risking. So, that makes me feel better. You've then got money going into innovations and more products and services and so on and so forth. So I kind of feel it has a very positive knock-on effect if that happens at the beginning.
So I agree with everything you said.
Bob, what's yours?
I was going to ask that.
I'll build what am I 100% on, kind of the sort of more rigorous and analytical connection between sustainability and enterprise value creation. And I agree again with Rebecca that it's not a binary thing. So, and I see that happening. And so in some ways, I think the pushback on ESG and the skepticism, it's been a good wake-up call. So, I think that's good. I think companies are getting it, investors are getting it. I think carbon markets, carbon pricing, absolutely essential. I still think it can happen. I've written a piece called U.S. Carbon Markets and Federal Debt Create the Perfect Storm for a Carbon Tax. And I wrote that piece channeling a libertarian guy who was like a little bit nervous about writing. I can write whatever I want, right? I know Republicans who support a carbon tax and a carbon price. You all know about my GOP outreach campaign. I'm liberal in Massachusetts. I know so many Republicans. I'm introducing Republicans to each other. I'm like rocking it with Republicans. So if I had to stick one thing to build on what you said, Andrea, and I mentioned that in the piece that I wrote, I do agree. I think the NGO community is fundamentally important, as I said, that the canaries in the coal mine, they need to engage better with businesses, more of this back and forth. They need to talk to people that have different ideological views than they do. You can write off ESG as an acronym, and I don't think that's important. Sustainability, sustainable value creation, I'm not seeing a lot of pushback, in the kind of sensible conservative community. I think if we could find ways to get NGOs to engage more with basically conservatives, the benefit that would unlock from this by having both sides learn from each other, I think it's important. And I think, at least in the United States, I don't think we're going to make really real progress until that happens, because we've got to find ways to depoliticize the topic, climate, and all of these other things. So that would be what I'd want to see. And as you know, I'm kind of in my own poor way. I'm sort of working on that in between flipping my tire, lifting my weights. But, we're over, and I apologize. I'm a bad timekeeper. But thanks again to my wonderful panelists, Rebecca Marmot, Andrea Webster, Sabine Hoefnagel. Peter will call it a wrap and let everybody go back to their vacations and coffee and whatever they're doing. And have a nice day.